At 6, the 3 teenagers who died in the care of a mental health trust in the northeast of England.
You can count on me like 1, 2, 3.
17-year-old Christy Hartnett took her own life. An independent report identified a string of failures at the trust looking after her. Her family thought she was getting help.
If you tell them everything that's going on in your head, they'll help you and you'll be able to live your life.
Her family are now calling for urgent change. Also on the programme, the Prime Minister changes his mind. Rishi Sunak will go to the COP27 climate conference in Egypt next week after previously saying he was too busy to attend. Sharing the road, but new research shows a third of motorists think cyclists should be banned from the roads altogether. Changing life in Russia, how tighter and more repressive controls are bringing back memories from the past. We have a special report from St. Petersburg.
Dougie's waiting for some new friends to arrive.
And how the BBC's Hey Dougie is helping young Ukrainian refugees feel more at home.
Also on BBC London this hour, how households can save on energy bills as prices continue to soar. And the Science Museum aiming to attract more people to a career as science technicians.
Good evening and welcome to the BBC News at 6. Investigations into the deaths of 3 teenagers with mental health issues have found they died after a catalogue of failures by the NHS Trust treating them. Christy Hartnett, Nadia Sharif and Emily Moore were 17 and 18 years old. They were in the care of the Tees, Esk and Wear Valley Trust, and all 3, who were friends, died within 8 months of each other. They were treated at West Lane Hospital, which provided specialist child and adolescent mental health services, including treatment for eating disorders. The reports into their deaths found a total of 120 failures in the treatment provided to them. Our North of England correspondent Fiona Trott has spoken to Christy's family, who are calling for urgent change.
You can count on me like 1, 2, 3.
Singing constantly and dancing around the rooms all the time.
And the smile.
Yeah.
The biggest smile.
Every time, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Even
But
in
behind
hospital.
the smile, Christy Hartnett was suffering.
She was different, for want of a better word. She'd hide under tables and throw stuff around the classroom.
After years of mental health issues, Christy was admitted to West Lane Hospital with anorexia.
How it was there is more reminiscent of how the Victorian institutions used to be.
You know, having to clean the blood up off their own walls from headbanging. Part of their policy was that the kids had to clean it up because they needed to learn that...
To manage their illness.
To manage their illness, yeah.
I remember telling her, if you tell them everything that's going on in your head, they'll help you.
Yeah.
And you'll be able to live your life.
But while Christy was here, the family believe her mental health got worse. They say she was unlawfully strip-searched. She was even discharged to hotel accommodation where she harmed herself. The trust is due in court next year, accused of breaching the Health and Social Care Act. As for the hospital itself, it's now being run by a different trust. When you read Christy's report, what's really confronting is that there are a whole list of issues here which the authors believe had a direct impact on her death, not recognising the risks after a ligature attempt 3 months before she died, a shortage of skilled staff, a lack of secure NHS and social care places. The report's authors say such issues, we believe, were the root causes of Christy's death.
That's big.
Mm-hmm.
What do you say to that?
Even there's a multifaceted and systematic failing.
Words they've waited more than 3 years to see, but what they say is tough.
It was horrible reading it because it's there in black and white that it was their fault. You know, there was always a bit of doubt in that we'd get that much.
We were right. We were right all along in saying how awful it was in there for these young people.
Today, the Trust says it is deeply sorry.
We've changed our clinical and operational structures. We've introduced new sorts of roles. For example, lived experience directors, probably one of the first trusts in the country, which allow us to bring the voice of the patient to the top tables. We've been investing over £5 million in the last 2 years in improving our ward environments to make them safer.
Nadia Sharif also died whilst being treated at West Lane Hospital. Today's report says staff weren't fully trained to deal with her autism, and a failure to address self-ligature risks was a root cause of her death. That failure was a feature in the Emily Moore report too. She took her own life at a different hospital. Christie's family, along with Nadia and Emily's, are waiting for the full inquests into their deaths.
It's hard, it's really hard. She's not here. Miss her. It's a big miss. It's a big miss.
Well, that was Christie's grandmother ending that report there. Today's publications did show examples of good practice at the Trust, and some of the relatives say they thought the investigation was excellent, it was thorough, and finally they know what the failings were, but they say they still don't know how they occurred. They're calling for a public inquiry. They say they want urgent change because what their daughters went through, they say, should never happen to another vulnerable young person ever again.
Fiona, thank you. And if you've been affected by any of the issues that have been discussed in that report or would like to learn more, do visit bbc.co.uk/actionline for more information. The Prime Minister has changed his mind and will now attend next week's COP27 climate summit in Egypt. The U-turn comes in the wake of widespread criticism, including from Conservative MPs, after Rishi Sunak said he couldn't go because he would be too busy preparing for the autumn statement. Let's speak to our political editor, Chris Mason, in Westminster. So why this sudden about turn?
Well, he reckons he's got time now. He thinks that enough progress is being made with that budget coming up in a fortnight for him to have space in his diary for a quick dash to Egypt and back for this summit. He told MPs at lunchtime there is no long-term prosperity without action on climate change and no energy security without investment in renewables. One other thing, he also learnt yesterday that one Boris Johnson, yes, the Prime Minister before last, would be rocking up himself. Now the current Prime Minister deciding that he wants to be there on his first foreign trip in the job, a chance to meet fellow world leaders. But this about turn on the summit is indicative of a broader thing that we're seeing within government at the moment, that we have a don't know yet government right now. Rishi Sunak has come in and is not committing explicitly to all sorts of promises that he made over the summer when he was first campaigning for Prime Minister, or necessarily to things that were in the Conservative manifesto back in 2019. They're making the case that that is pragmatic, that this is a Prime Minister who was a backbencher just a couple of weeks ago. They want to think things through before they announce them, and I suspect in the next fortnight before that budget there'll be plenty more don't know yets in answer to specific questions. But that line will only last for so long.
Chris Mason, thank you. The Football World Cup kicks off in Qatar in 18 days' time, the first time it's being staged in the Middle East. FIFA, world football's governing body, claimed it would be the first carbon-neutral tournament. But environmentalists are furious and are now challenging that claim. In an open letter, a group of professional footballers are also demanding that FIFA drops its carbon-neutral claim, with one telling the BBC that the tournament is an absolute disaster in terms of its environmental footprint. Our sports editor, Dan Roan, reports.
Despite being staged in the desert kingdom of Qatar, organisers of the upcoming World Cup have long hailed the green credentials of the event. This recyclable stadium, just one of a number of initiatives promoted by high-profile tournament ambassadors.
The Qatar World Cup has set a real example in sustainability and what can be achieved.
But today, FIFA's official forecast of the event's likely carbon footprint was disputed by one renowned climate scientist.
They're estimating 3.6 million tonnes. We think it's way over the 10 million tonne mark, so 3 times that at least. The idea that they've somehow made it green by cheap, nasty so-called offsets that just don't undo the damage from the emissions at all, to become carbon neutral, that doesn't stack up at all.
Despite the impact of constructing 7 new stadia in tiny Qatar, one of the highest carbon-emitting countries per capita in the world, and the flights of more than 1 million fans, FIFA claims the footprint will be offset.
our joint pledge to make this next major tournament fully carbon neutral.
But the BBC can reveal that that claim is now the subject of a series of formal complaints by environmental campaigners to advertising standards authorities in 5 countries across Europe. This one, filed in the UK, says that statements related to the carbon neutrality of the World Cup were wrong and likely to mislead consumers, relying on deeply flawed carbon accounting calculations. Meanwhile, a host of footballers, including Norway international Morten Thorsby, have signed an open letter to FIFA asking it to scrap its claims of carbon neutrality.
This tournament is an absolute disaster in terms of also its environmental footprint. World Cup is extremely important, but at the same time we have to make it more sustainable. We have to work in finding solutions to make it better.
FIFA says it's taking concrete steps, such as energy-efficient stadia and offsetting emissions through investing in certified carbon credits. In a statement, it said it was fully aware of the impacts mega events have and had been making substantial efforts to tackle them and remains committed to continuously improve its approaches in collaboration with key stakeholders. Qatar's organising committee, meanwhile, emphasised that no internal flights would be required at this most compact of World Cups, pointing to a fleet of hundreds of electric buses and vowing the stadia would remain in use after the event. But despite the excitement they generate, the concern is that the sheer scale of such events now means fundamental change is required if they're ever to be truly sustainable. Dan Rowan, BBC News.
Council leaders from Kent have warned that the county is at breaking point because of the burden of accommodating migrants. The leaders of 14 authorities, including Kent County Council and Medway, have written to the Home Secretary warning that the overcrowding at Manston Migrant Processing Facility was at a critical point and could lead to disorder. The Albanian Prime Minister said Suella Braverman was discriminating against Albanians to excuse the UK's border failures. The government is spending billions of pounds to encourage more people to cycle rather than drive. But new research suggests a third of motorists would like to see cyclists banned from the roads altogether. And many admitted deliberately driving too close. Changes to the highway code this year mean cyclists now have priority over cars and are allowed to cycle in the middle of the lane to make themselves more visible. Panorama's Richard Bilton reports on the sometimes difficult relationship between cyclists and motorists sharing our roads, and his report begins with footage of accidents.
If you cycle regularly in the UK, you'll have had one of these. There are more cyclists on the road than for 50 years, and disputes are commonplace. It's not always drivers who are to blame. We wanted to know what motorists across the UK thought of cyclists. Some questions from Panorama were added to a survey. 28% say they don't consider cyclists to be equal partners on the road. A third think cyclists shouldn't be on the road at all. And 1 in 4 admit they have knowingly driven too close to cyclists. Earlier this year, the government changed the highway code to give bikes priority over cars. Cyclists can now ride in the middle of the lane if it's safer, and drivers are supposed to give them at least 5 feet of space.
If I go over to the left on bends and hills like this, it's encouraging drivers to try and sneak past to make a break for it, and that is far more dangerous. He shouldn't be doing that. That's a dual white line and we're on the brow of a hill.
On average, 2 cyclists are killed every week and more than 300 are injured. This CCTV footage shows Damien Natali and Andy Coles setting off on their final bike ride. They were climbing this hill near High Wycombe when they were hit by a car and killed. The driver was given a fine and a suspended sentence.
Shock for them. It's like, oh well, they were cycling up a road and they got killed. And,
he carelessly ran into 2 people.
Yeah, you know. I feel that you're saying to someone, if you go on the road and you are killed like Dame and Andy, it's not really a big affair. You know, it will be to you, but you know, the law is not on your side. It doesn't.
Is that how it feels?
It feels like, oh, definitely feels like the law's not on your side when it comes to cycling.
It's reflective of how society sees cycling.
The government is spending billions trying to get more cyclists onto the road, but this survey suggests a lot of drivers don't want them there. Richard Bilton, BBC News.
And you can see Richard Bilton's full report on tonight's Panorama, which is on BBC One at 8 p.m. or also on the iPlayer right now. The time is 6:15. Our top story this evening. Investigations into the deaths of 3 young women with mental health issues find more than 100 failings by the trust treating them in the northeast of England. And police chiefs say they're determined to improve standards after a report claims hundreds of officers should have failed vetting checks.
Also coming up, jailed for being part of a racist and misogynistic police WhatsApp group. Scotland Yard call them despicable. And he's nearly done it, the severely sight-impaired kayaker who's paddling the Thames.
The cost of making a cup of tea went up significantly last month as food prices continued to rise at record rates. Costs for tea bags, milk and sugar all rose in October, according to the trade body, the British Retail Consortium. Food price inflation jumped from 10.6% to 11.6%. Higher costs for ingredients and energy are all contributing to the rise in prices, as well as a shortage of workers. The rising cost of food is affecting charities too. At a time when they're seeing increasing need, donations are falling and rising prices mean they can't afford to buy replacements. Here's our social affairs correspondent, Michael Buchanan.
These empty pallets show the stark reality for some charities. Falling donations mean it's a weekly scramble for this charity to fill up to 1,000 food boxes a week for needy families across the northeast.
We used to have 19 items in a box of food that we sent out. We're down to 17 now because we just simply don't have the money to put those extra items in.
And what have you taken out?
We've taken out tea bags and we're just on the point of taking out meat.
The charity was formed to provide help at Christmas, and last year 9,000 hampers were distributed. This year it'll likely be far fewer.
Last year the Christmas cake cost us 93p. This year the price we're quoted is £1.40. So at the moment, I can only commit to buying 6,000. I can't blow the whole of the budget just on Christmas cakes.
Wherever I've been to do a drop-off, people are saying it's going out as soon as it's coming in.
It does, it's like a revolving door.
A few miles away, a much-needed donation for a small food bank in Newcastle. Its shelves are also near empty, just as demand is surging.
We're nearly at crisis point again. And if we don't continue getting donations in, we are at risk of closing.
Like businesses, charities will benefit from a government scheme to cut energy bills for 6 months. But other costs are rising, donations are falling, and demands are increasing.
Our members were at the front line of supporting people during the COVID crisis over the last 2 or 3 years. They haven't really recovered from the impact of that, and now they're facing this massive double whammy.
At this drop-in centre for the homeless in Manchester, they're seeing more and more people seeking help. But the organisers are reaching the limit of what they can do. Staff have been cut and some services have been reduced.
We're having to say no to people at the minute because our guests are used to coming in and getting a pair of box shorts and a pair of socks, and we're not having the donations in that we were having, so we're having to say no about that. We can still provide the food and stuff, but we haven't gotten it in the abundance that we did have.
One irony of the cost of living crisis is that those now seeking help are the very people that often donated to the charities that are now struggling to support them. Michael Buchanan, BBC News.
Life continues to change for people in Russia 8 months after the Ukraine invasion. Controls on people are becoming more repressive and there are new restrictions on public expression, tough penalties for those who dare to protest. Some academics are drawing comparisons with memories of a darker past when Joseph Stalin ruled the Soviet Union with an iron fist. Millions of Russians died during Stalin's brutal dictatorship, part of history that Russia tries to forget. But as Steve Rosenberg reports from St. Petersburg, There are fears that the lessons from that time are needed today.
How many in Russia want to remember the darker chapters of their country's history? Very few. Every year, they gather to remember the Great Terror of the 1930s. By reading out the names of Joseph Stalin's victims, the million he executed, the millions more sent to prison camps. The Gulag has gone, but fear is returning. Repression is increasing by the week, local politician Sergei Troshin tells me. You can feel the fear today in Russian society. And we can feel we're being watched and filmed. Hardly undercover surveillance. For critics of the authorities, there are consequences. University lecturer Denis Skopin has just been sacked for immoral behaviour. He'd been arrested for protesting against mobilisation for the war in Ukraine. He'd spent 10 days in jail. But look at the send-off his students gave him on his last day at work.
I love my students very much. They understand very well what is happening now in Russia.
Denis says that many of his colleagues, academics and scientists, have fled Russia.
Russia is losing the best people now. The most educated, the most energetic, the most critically thinking people are leaving the country.
Where is Russia heading right now?
In short, Russia is going in the wrong direction.
And it feels like the past is still casting a shadow over Russia's present and future.
History never repeats itself exactly, but there are worrying parallels between Russia's past and present. Under Joseph Stalin, Soviet citizens who fell foul of the authorities were often labelled enemies of the people. After invading Ukraine, Vladimir Putin vowed to cleanse Russia of what he called traitors, scum, and the fifth column.
To help him do that, President Putin has introduced a new patriotic lesson in Russian schools. It's called Conversations About What's Important. In this conversation, Putin claims that in Ukraine, Russia is fighting to protect Russia. Critics call it indoctrination.
There are children who just believe, they open eyes and they are ready to believe in everything. And that is very dangerous.
Because if there's one thing Russian history teaches us, it is this: that if you believe in everything a leader here says and does, without question, that can have tragic consequences. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, St. Petersburg.
A damning report has warned that hundreds of police officers in England and Wales have been cleared to serve when they should have failed vetting procedures. The police watchdog looked at 8 forces and reviewed hundreds of vetting files. Our Home Affairs correspondent Tom Simons is here. Tom.
Sophie, it is too easy for the wrong people to get in. That's the verdict of this report, and the concerns go back a decade. This is Stephen Mitchell, Northumbria police officer, jailed for rape and sexual assaults committed on duty in 2011. Now, when he joined the police, previous allegations against him weren't revealed to the vetting process. Or another one, Ian Nord from Cheshire Police, convicted of child sexual abuse. Past allegations against him were put on the police database, but he wasn't required to have extra vetting. And Wayne Couzens, the murderer of Sarah Everard. His vetting is still being investigated. Today's report was commissioned because of that horrific case. The inspectors closely examined sample vetting from 8 forces.
About 1 in 5 of them is somebody we think either just shouldn't have joined, or if they were going to join, should have had some special controls put around them. I don't think it's being taken seriously enough. I don't think police leadership realises how important it is. I don't think police leaders realise the risk they carry by not having higher vetting standards, and therefore it's too easy for the wrong people to get in.
Now, a bit more on those findings. The police watchdog examined 725 cases where officers were vetted. In 131, the decision was questionable at best. This is Nicola Brooks, a police inspector from Sussex Police who dealt with her allegation of stalking, was sacked for gross misconduct. Why? He abused his position and he engineered a brief sexual relationship with her where she was vulnerable. And she's not the only one.
As my investigation proves, they target the most vulnerable women. And it's usually women with, like, you know, domestic violence, serious stalking. And nobody questions them because they are veteran, experienced officers. You are not going to change that culture overnight. There's clearly not any vetting going on throughout the officers' careers, which is what I think is what needs to be done.
Today's report agrees and also recommends that all past allegations against current or future officers are examined closely, even if they didn't end up in court. Police chiefs are under pressure to recruit thousands of new officers lost in past cuts, but they say they are determined to improve vetting and to root out bad cops. Sophie.
Tom, thank you. Health and social care services in Scotland look set to face cuts after the Deputy First Minister John Swinney announced £615 million of savings on top of substantial cuts announced in September. He said the additional measures were needed to balance the books. Our Scotland correspondent Lorna Gordon is at Holyrood and has all the details. Lorna.
John Swinney said he wanted to wait until after the UK government's autumn statement to set out this emergency budget statement here in Scotland. But he said what, in his words, he described as the UK government's inactivity, followed by calamity, followed by austerity, meant that he could wait no longer. He said that because of inflation, there was a £1.7 billion shortfall in the Scottish government's budget compared to what was set out in December last year. He detailed hundreds of millions of pounds worth of cuts back in September. Today, he set out the details of a £615 million of further cuts to services. He called those reductions and reprioritisations in areas like health and social care and mental health funding. There was salami slicing in other areas like the rollout of broadband and marketing budgets, for instance. But he was also keen to set out the wider context that some of this money would be used to fund increases in public sector pay in, for instance, the NHS and local authorities, and also that more money would go to low-income households. There'd be doubling of budgets in areas for low-income families with children, for instance, and fuel insecurity funds. Now, the opposition parties here at the Scottish Parliament questioned whether this was the time for a national care service and why the changes to the mental health funding. But I think it's important to say that this is just the beginning. John Swinney said that the autumn statement by the UK government was likely to set out eye-watering cuts ahead.
Lorna, thank you. The man who scored one of the most iconic goals in FA Cup history, Ronnie Radford, has died at the age of 79. He scored the equaliser for non-league Hereford United against Newcastle United in the third round in 1972. His goal forced extra time, with Hereford going on to beat Newcastle in one of the competition's biggest upsets. There are thousands of Ukrainian children living in the UK who are trying to settle into new communities, new schools and new homes. To help them feel welcome, the BBC's children's television series Hey Dougie is adding some characters that they may well recognise. Our entertainment correspondent Colin Patterson has been taking a look.
Dougie is waiting for some new friends to arrive. They've come from a country called Ukraine.
This is Hey Dougie with a difference. The CBeebies series about a big brown dog and the squirrel club that he runs has become an institution. Its YouTube channel has received more than 1 billion views thanks to some very catchy songs. For its latest episode, the show decided to branch out, with a story aiming to help Ukrainian children living in the UK because of the war.
Shall we sing a song together and make our new friends feel welcome? Oof!
Hey Dougie teamed up with the makers of Mavka the Forest Song, an animated Ukrainian film. Both sets of characters joining together for a musical number, which also doubles as a two-way language lesson. In Coddington, Nottinghamshire, the episode was going down very well with its target audience. Oksana and her 5-year-old twins came to the UK as refugees earlier this year.
They like this song and they can speak English and study English with this program.
The biggest downside? Well, all those parents who end up having the ridiculously catchy tune stuck in their heads. Colin Patterson, BBC News, Nottinghamshire.
Time now for the weather with Stav. Hello.
Hi there, thank you very much, Sophie. Hello to you. What a stormy evening out there at the moment. Gales, even severe gales, some heavy rain spreading its way eastwards across much of the country, all down to a pretty potent area of low pressure. As you can see here, lots of isobars on the charts and the strong winds, and we've got weather fronts bringing outbreaks of rain. One such band of rain is pushing its way eastwards over the last few hours. Some heavy showers following on behind it. You can see some flashes of lightning there. This rain band becoming confined towards England and Wales, certainly the southeast quadrant towards the end of the night. Winds were a real feature though, gusting 50-60 miles an hour around some Irish sea coast, even more than up to 70 for western Scotland as we move through tonight. Now, like I mentioned, that rain band becomes confined to the southeast of England, East Anglia, and it stays very wet, very windy across Scotland. But the wind's easing down, I think, across much of the country for part 2 of the night. Still breezy, but not as windy as we're starting the night with. A cooler feel to things across the north and the west. Double-figure values across the southeast, where it will remain wet into tomorrow morning, thanks to that weather front. As we head through Thursday, that front clears away, but we see this next feature running into the southern half of the country through the afternoon. So it's a wet start for East Anglia and the southeast. That rain slow to clear. Eventually it will. Some showers following on behind there. Elsewhere, it's a bright day, sunshine and showers. Most of those showers across the southern half of the country. And again, winds picking up here. And a fresher day to come. I think 10 to 13 degrees will be the high. That system clears away during Thursday night, and for Friday, something a bit quieter. A ridge of high pressure nudges in across the country. So a drier day, more settled, sunshine around. There'll still be a few showers around. It's not going to be completely dry, but not a bad day to come. But for the weekend, low pressure moves back in. It's going to turn very unsettled, wet and windy at times. Sophie.
Staff, thank you. And that's it from us. It is time now to join our teams across the nations and regions for the news where you are. Goodbye.